Welcome, everybody. Today, we are going to be speaking with Dr. Jessica Knurick, who is a nutrition scientist and science communicator specializing in chronic disease prevention. So great to talk to you today. I really appreciate your time.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, David.
You do really great content debunking a lot of science and medical misinformation, which I love. It's a content niche that I both love and respect. Why do you think that the misinformation is sort of having a moment right now and it's spreading particularly well?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things. I think social media doesn't do us any favors in the misinformation space because, the way that it kind of rewards people is through fear and sensationalism and conspiratorial kind of thinking. And so I think a lot of it comes from just the platforms that we go to now for our information, because for better or worse, that's where people are going for their information. And then, I think also we are at a time where we all feel like there's something that's wrong with things that are impacting our health. Our food environment, our healthcare system, and I think that we are kind of ripe for trying to understand it. And a lot of people are coming in with narratives that may or may not be the actual reasons for the problem.
Yeah, the social media dynamics are really important. I mean, I've talked to people before and given the example of forget about what's accurate, but just compare the following two messages. The COVID vaccine is pretty good at preventing death and hospitalization. It's not really very good at preventing you from catching COVID, but depending on your health situation, it still would make sense to get. Okay, that's one message. The
Yep.
other message is millions of people are being killed by the vaccine. Even ignoring which is true, we intuitively know which of those is most likely to be liked, shared, and commented on based on the algorithms. And that seems to be a challenge that we're up against.
Yeah, 100%. I wanna listen to the second one more than the first one, right? So that's the primary issue with science communication right now, is figuring out how to break through from the noise, because and stay giving accurate and nuanced information, or being able to give accurate and nuanced information in an engaging way. And so I think that's what a lot of us are wrestling right now with in science communication, is how can we best do that to actually make people wanna watch the information, but give appropriate nuance, and not be sensational as well.
I'm wondering if you would agree with this is a general statement. It doesn't apply to all of the claims, and we'll look at some of these claims, but oftentimes these kind of deceptive or misleading medical and nutritional claims, there's some kernel of reality around which they're based. Like, for example, the whole food dye thing with
Mhm.
RFK Jr. Is it probably better to avoid food dyes in the sense that the foods that have them tend to be ultra processed foods? Like, I think that that's probably true, that that's based in evidence. Even if you buy the counter is, even if you eat 10 bags of Skittles, the amount of actual dye you're consuming seems so low that the bigger issue is just sort of like, what's the big picture of the foods that we're consuming? I don't know if I'm asking the question clearly, but like, do you agree that there's often a kernel of truth from which the misinformation kind of grows?
Yeah, I think it's a great example that you just gave, but absolutely. I think almost always there's the most effective misleading or misinformation has a kernel of truth. That's why it's so effective, because you know intuitively, okay, that is true. There's something in there is true, and then they weave kind of a conspiratorial narrative about why that's true. And we see that in almost everything. So it's a lot more difficult to kind of explain the nuance there, that with food dyes, for example, where food dyes, whether they're honestly, whether they're synthetic or the natural based derived food dyes, where they show up in our food system are in foods that we would otherwise recommend that we consume less of. Not necessarily not consume them, but consume less of, right? They're going to be in your candies and your sodas and your really like sugary, kind of high fat, sugar, salt foods that are devoid of kind of other nutrition like fiber and other nutrients. And so we would, as nutrition professionals, we would recommend we consume less of those. Are we recommending that because it contains a food dye? No, we're recommending it because of the overall kind of nutrient package of that food, which is not health promoting. And so that's kind of the reality of the situation, but it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more difficult to kind of get across than the alternative.
I see an analogy between financial services marketing and a lot of the sort of food and nutrition misinformation. And I'll see if I can
Mhm.
explain it. One of the things I used to work in financial services and financial advising, insurance, all this sort of stuff. One of the things about that space is that if everybody was honest about how relatively simple the most important principles are, that'll get you like 90% of the way there, a lot of people would never hire a financial advisor or buy complicated products. It's like, listen, you want to be saving at least X percent. You don't need to be picking stocks, invest in simple index funds, pick your risk tolerance. That tells you how much cash stock bonds do you need. It's like, it's really very simple. And if everybody was upfront about that, a lot of the people selling products wouldn't make any money. Similarly, it seems to me that by overcomplicating and finding, when you heat the seed oils, it releases, and then we don't know how it interacts with. When you complicate, it seems that it creates an opportunity for people to sell stuff. Do you think there's something to my analogy here?
I mean, I have made that exact analogy before. I completely
Oh,
agree.
you
I
have?
think
Okay.
I think it's not just selling stuff. I think that's a big part of it, but it's also when you're creating content, you have to consistently create content, right? And there's only so many times you can tell somebody in the nutrition space, for example, eat as many nutrient dense foods as possible, eat more fruits and vegetables, eat more fiber, drink more water, and limit these like low nutrient ultra processed foods as much as possible. I mean, a walk. Those, because that's going to be like 90%. I mean, the basics of health, which I could rattle off in like less than 10 items, are going to be like 90+% of what's determining our health. But what happens is creators are consistently creating content and they want eyeballs, oftentimes to sell things. And so what they'll do is they'll focus on that kind of 1%, right? Or the extreme things that are in the margins in terms of what's impacting health or even not impacting health. And then that's what they'll focus most of the content on. So what we see on social media is really this very small kind of on the margins amount of information that would actually impact health, but we're seeing it. That's most of the information we're seeing. And then we kind of forget the basics and we forget the fundamentals, or we don't focus on the fundamentals. And we see it, with the supplement industry all the time. Like, these supplements are going to do this for you, but then, somebody's purchasing it who's not doing kind of those really basic things that we would recommend for health.
What do you think are the one or two most dangerous things that have been either explicitly or sort of implicitly promoted by the RFK MAHA agenda?
I think certainly this idea, because what I always say, often say this, but the MAHA movement kind of came about because of this idea and this understanding that something's not right, right? I kind of mentioned this, and in a very bipartisan way across the board, we all can kind of understand that our food environment right now is not a health promoting food environment. We have a healthcare system that's failing people. We have, environmental pollution that many of us would like to see less environmental pollution. So most of us can agree on kind of the problem. Yeah, the issue is where did that problem come from, and then what are the solutions? So you have to understand the causes to then understand the solutions to the problem. And I think with the MAHA movement and RFK Jr. Like specifically, RFK Jr. has been an anti-vaxxer for many decades. That's where he made his name. That's where many of us in science have been watching him kind of come up. That's really his goal. Like, I don't even think he ever really spoke about nutrition. Maybe I'm wrong, but I never heard it like pre-MAHA movement, right? I think that that's what he used kind of to usher in his anti-vax agenda into HHS. And so I think one of the biggest things, to answer your question directly, that is so concerning about the movement is this idea that we're putting kind of this the blame on scientists and public health institutions instead of kind of where it belongs, which would be this idea of corporate greed, right? Where corporations they don't really care about your health. Like, it's not that they're out to get you. It's just that their primary goal is profit and growth in our society, right? And so that's what they're doing. And so if that means that creating a food environment that is not health promoting, that's what they're going to do, because their goal is to their shareholders, their responsibility is to their shareholders to maximize profit and growth. And so that's going to mean cutting costs in ingredients. That's going to mean marketing to children and to low income populations where they can sell more of these products. And again, it's not that they're out to make us unhealthy. It's just they don't care if we are healthy or not. And so that's how we get these kind of systems that are really good for corporate profit at the expense of our health. Meanwhile, we have scientists, we have public health institutions that are trying to fight against this and have been for a long time, that are kind of chronically underfunded. And then you have a movement kind of come in, placing blame there and now making tons of cuts to science and public health, while partnering with an administration that is decisively pro business and pro industry, and
One
making
of the
policy decisions benefiting them.
One of the things that they often will talk about are toxic additives into our food. And I would love for you to talk about that a little bit, because I think it's very evocative language that promotes this idea of, here is an unadulterated food, and it's being loaded with this extra stuff that you both don't need and is acutely unhealthy for you. What do you think of this whole narrative around so-called toxic additives? What's the truth of it?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing too, because if you believe that there's toxic additives, you should be fully supportive of fully funding the FDA, right? And having a very strong FDA. And this is the thing with MAHA. A lot of them, I think, just don't understand. They want more regulation. Like, if we want to make sure that there's not toxic additives in our food supply, we need to be having people working in our regulatory agencies and scientists being in there testing the safety of these food additives. What I will say is, we have an otherwise there's a difference between a safe food supply and a health promoting food supply. And so, in terms of a safe food supply, our food supply has always been relatively safe. And you see this on kind of global standards, the Global Food Security Index. When they look at quality and safety of our food supply, we're ranked third in the entire world for quality and safety of our food supply. When there are additives that have been shown to cause harm, we saw this with trans fat, for example, the FDA works to remove those from the food supply. And so I think that it's a bit of a misdirection to suggest that that's the problem. I talk about this all the time. If you look at the American diet, we are over 90% of us are not consuming the recommended intake of vegetables. Around 95% of us are not meeting fiber intake guidelines. So that means 95% of us are not meeting the minimum that we would recommend for fiber. Over half of us are eating too much added sugar. Like, these are really the major issues with our food supply and with our diets, but that we're kind of getting distracted because it's more sensational and it's more scary sounding and it's more fear-based, about as if it's an additive problem, when it's really just a dietary composition problem, what we are overly consuming. Again, I mentioned this, 70% of our food supply are these ultra-processed foods, and many of those are these low-nutrient ultra-processed foods, because within that definition, there's a lot of variability. But that's really the problem. And my issue is, when we focus all of our attention on something that we don't have strong evidence that actually impacts our health too much, we're distracted from the things we know impacts our health.
Let me ask you a little bit specifically about added sugar, because something interesting is going on right now with labeling. At my gym, I won't say the brand, but there's a cereal that all of these people who clearly spend a lot of the time at the gym are walking around with. And it's a cereal that is marketed as high protein, high fiber, and no added sugar. And when I looked at this cereal in the grocery store, you look at the line that says added sugar, and it does say 0. It's very sweet, though. And when you look at the ingredients, I don't remember if it's monk fruit extract or beet sugar or whatever. But labeling has determined that certain types of sweeteners, sugar and corn syrups, do count as added sugar. It seems to me that these are sweetened cereals, sweetened with items that right now don't have to be labeled as added sugar. Is that nutritionally relevant, or are you just having something that's sweetened with a different type of sweetener, and in the body, it's really the same thing? Like, I guess what I'm asking is, have a lot of food manufacturers figured out how to game the labeling requirements?
Yeah, it's a good question. The sweeteners, if they're not required to be included in the added sugar label, that's because they're not calorie containing sugars. So we have these non-nutritive sweeteners, they're called, and that means that they don't contain calories. And we wouldn't add them into added sugar, because added sugars are calorie containing macronutrients, right? So they're carbohydrates. They contain 4 calories per gram, and so that's why they're on a food label like that. So they're required to be included in the ingredient list, but we wouldn't include them in that actual nutrition panel, because those are what's listed there within the carbohydrate label and sugars are calorie containing sugars. So
They're
that's
not
not really a
contributing
nefarious
calories,
thing.
in other words.
Correct. So yeah, food corporations will use those because they're non-nutritive, so they don't have calories, so they don't have to be added into the sugar because they don't impact you the same as sugar does. A lot of people don't like the flavor of those non-nutritive sweeteners, so it certainly changes the flavor. Like if you're somebody like me who can tell like kind of these non-nutritive sweeteners, you'll try it and you'll be like, oh, that is way too sweet and also doesn't taste like sugar. But yeah, that's the reason. And food corporations again, they're trying to market to what people are going to buy. So if their target audience is like gym, like high end gym, right? They're going to use what we call health washing on their packaged foods, and they're going to say, oh, they're going to add a few. There's like a whey protein shortage right now because all of these food manufacturers are trying to add protein into their prepackaged ultra processed foods to make it seem healthier. And so, these like protein companies can't get access to the protein they otherwise were. And because of the food corporations kind of buying it up and adding it into things like chips or crackers to kind of add a couple grams of protein so they can put high protein on the label.
If this is a difficult question to answer, that's totally cool. But can we say that it is healthier when there is one of these non-nutritive sweeteners that doesn't add calories? Like, are you making a healthier choice when you choose that?
I mean, you're making a choice that you're eating less sugar, and that is something that we would recommend. So, for example, like if you're drinking a diet soda over a regular soda, you're consuming less sugar, which for the average American, that's a good thing. On like overall, yes, that would be what we would say.
I'd love to ask you a little bit about seed oils. I now see both products and even restaurants that market never any seed oils. And
Yep.
when I've, as a layperson, looked at the peer reviewed science, I don't see the claims that seed oils are inflammatory in the studies I've looked at. I don't see the big warning signs around seed oils. What's the truth about them, and how did this become such a big marketing tool?
Yeah, it's really interesting, David, because like with the food dye thing, there's some nuance there that we could talk about. With the seed oil thing, it just defies nutrition science. Like
Hmm.
what we know in the actual evidence when we look at these studies, global nutrition science studies, not just the U.S., we look globally over long periods of time, epidemiological studies, randomized controlled trials. What we know to be true is that seed oils are not detrimental to health. Like there's just not evidence to suggest that. If there were, I'd be the first person talking about it. When there was a good amount of evidence to suggest trans fats were harmful, like we as public health experts, nutrition scientists, we were the ones pushing to get that out of the food supply. Like that's the reason that a lot of us get into this field is to make sure that we're helping people eat as healthful as optimally as possible. With seed oils, they're consumed globally. We have lots of data on them. The overall consensus is that they are not harmful for health. And in fact, if you swap out saturated fats for most people and swap in polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are these seed oils, polyunsaturated fatty acids, by the way, have our essential fatty acids, which are things like omega 3s and omega 6s, which means we have to get those from the diet in order to survive. Our body doesn't make them. Our body can make, they can synthesize endogenously, which is like inside the body, a lot of fatty acids and a lot of nutrients, but those two you can't. And so you get them from polyunsaturated fats. And seed oils are a good source of those. We see studies where if you swap out saturated fat and you and you exchange it for these polyunsaturated fats that can come from seed oils, you see better health outcomes. You see better cardiovascular markers. And yeah, I think that it comes from this idea that natural is better and seed oils go through this extraction method, to get the oil out of the seed. But that's just the naturalistic fallacy, which, I believed for a long time until I went through a lot of science education, which I completely understand the idea that someone might think that, but it's just not true.
To kind of wrap up, if there are 3 to 5 very basic ideas that everybody can think about applying to really simplify all of the different evidence-based suggestions that you give, what is sort of the lowest hanging fruit in the nutrition space?
Meet your dietary fiber needs. 95% of us don't. This is what you're looking for, right? Like
Yeah.
recommendations? Yeah. Meet your dietary fiber needs, reduce the amount of added sugar that you're consuming, eat more fruits or fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables. Like just try to make half your plate. We used to have my plate before we got this inverted food pyramid, and my plate was half fruits and vegetables, right? So try to do that. Like make your plate about half vegetables. Like make sure you're having a vegetable at every meal, and that's going to help you. Something that I talk to people about sometimes to like help increase the vegetables that they're consuming is like every time you go to the grocery store or like every other time, pick a new vegetable. Like try a variety of things. So eat a variety of different foods. Sometimes we get stuck on eating the same foods over and over, but if you can eat a variety of foods, you're benefiting from the nutrition from a lot of different types of foods, which is helpful. And then I'd say probably, you know, pending that you're able to, because this is a problem in our country with our food supply. We have a lot of areas that we term food deserts, which they don't have ready access to fresh fruits and vegetables and produce. And they have an abundance of access to these prepackaged ultra processed foods. But, as much as you're able to, try to eat these like whole nutrient dense foods as much as possible. You don't have to completely get rid of these prepackaged foods because, it's life and it's just not necessary from a nutrition perspective. Like start thinking, I think the biggest thing that I could say is like start thinking of your diet as a dietary pattern. Like what are you eating consistently over time? Not what does one food say, not what is one ingredient that I'm consuming, but what are you eating over time? And making sure that, you've heard of this 80-20 rule. It really is true. Like making sure that about 80% of what you're eating, it's a made up statistic, but it gives you kind of an idea of what you're eating are more nutrient dense foods. And then don't worry about the rest as much.
Final question. Do we have a verdict on eggs at this point, which at one point was the worst thing you could possibly eat? Then it became the best thing. It's not the cholesterol, it's the saturated fat. But when I look, each egg only has like 1.5 grams of saturated fat. Like, what's the bottom line on eggs, would you say?
Yeah, eggs are like the primary example of nutrition science kind of changing or recommendations changing. I think a lot of people think it changes a lot. Like it doesn't. I mean, the basics that we've been recommending have been pretty consistent over decades. But certainly, eggs is a good example. There used to be, you know, right now the recommendation is for most people, unless there's an issue because there's individual like variability here. But for most people, eggs are fine to consume. They're a good nutrient dense source of food, protein, healthful fats, and so they're a pretty good choice. So I consume eggs.
And is there some number of eggs, or is it just a matter of the total picture of your saturated fat intake?
Yeah, it's a total picture of saturated fat. It's a total picture of what your whole diet looks like. Like if you have a 2 egg omelet, usually that's fine for most people. But the recommendation, which remained in these dietary guidelines, is to keep your total saturated fat to less than 10% of total calories, and which is tough because like who knows what that number is. But it just kind of gives you an idea that you kind of want to limit it as much as possible.
All right, we've been speaking with Dr. Jessica Knurick. Really appreciate your time and your insights, and we'll link out to your various platforms that you're publishing on. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, David.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, bye.